Hey guys, I got a special episode of Entitled Millennials Thinking Out Loud for you today. Got a longtime comrade and friend of the show, Colton Power here. He's something of a, self-made expert, autodidact on events that have been going on in Ukraine, so the precursor information to the war, what led up to the war, and he's been a really valuable asset or resource for me. With me, I'm kind of jumping all over, have my pulse on a lot of different topics, so I don't always get to do as much of a deep dive. But Colton Power's been a good asset and keeping me up to date, sending information on the ground footage and stuff like that. So I thought it would be useful. We did a lot of coverage on the Ukraine war early on, but we've kind of dropped off, talked more about the labor movement and things like that. But with this new spring offensive that seems to be coming and this sort of seeming stalemate that they're talking about in the media, I thought it would be useful going into the spring to kind of do a recap and talk about where these things are going. So without further ado, we have Colton Power here if you want to introduce yourself. Let people know who you are and some of the resources you've used to garner some knowledge on this topic.
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me here. It's my first time ever really doing any kind of political talk show or dialogue.
Yeah, we're super nervous, guys. Both of us are super.
Yeah,
that's all right.
You're good. I wouldn't call myself a pseudo expert or anything, just kind of obsessed more or less. From a young age, I guess my third grade social studies class, we weren't supposed to learn it in our school curriculum, but we ended up having a bunch of extra time. So our teacher got into the specifics of the Second World War. And I just got super obsessed with the nitty gritty, specific battles and specific events. And when this conflict escalated in February 2022, I saw basically the possibility for a similar event, world changing, life changing event happening right in front of my eyes. And I'm there is no way that I'm going to miss a single second of this. So when I first started just kind of looking at the conflict, I was keeping up with individual Telegram channels. I was taking Google Translate and translating Ukrainian and Russian sources and going back and forth between all these different sources. And I found quite a few people online talking about it. And I find you get a couple categories of analysts, specifically political analysts online. And that's what I really appreciate about your work. You tend to be in the category of, I guess what I would just call no BS. Just straight up, here's the facts, here's what's going on, here's the potential outcomes, this is what it could lead to. But you see a lot of people that take a specific headline or a very specific event, and then they just kind of spiral off into, this is turning into World War III, this is doom for Ukraine, this is doom for Russia, and I don't think there's any value in that kind of... So, go ahead.
They try to spin it towards their bias or to serve a political agenda.
Yeah.
Right.
Or just for clickbait even. And it's
tempting, that clickbait. I tell you. I've managed to avoid it so far, but there's certain days I'm like, let me use all capitals. Let me, But anyway, go on.
Well, I guess if you really wanted to, you could, speaking of that kind of clickbait, I think the overall point I want to get to is this conflict leading to World War III? And I think that would be a great title for you one way or another. But
all right, clickbait it is.
Right? Back on track.
Yeah, okay, go on, yeah.
I eventually came across Alexander Mercouris of the Duran and Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. And I found, kind of keeping up with the events on the ground, these guys were the most accurate in their reporting, the least sensationalist, the most factual. Alexander Mercouris never really presents anything as absolute fact. He says, these are the reports I'm seeing from this source, and so I think it's most likely that this is happening. And I think that's really refreshing in our political climate, especially around this conflict, because there's been a lot of misinformation, and it's been quite a shit show so far, to say the least.
It has.
So
yeah. Just off the cuff with the way that the mainstream Western media handles it. I mean, it's just war porn propaganda to a very sickening degree. I mean, it's some of the most impressive political theater I've ever seen, and it's been having, I'm 29 years old now. I have lived through the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. I was part of the generation. Again, I guess I don't know how old you are, Colton, but I was
26.
young, 26. So you're in the same ballpark. I remember when they wheeled the fucking TV into the classroom for 9/11.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, it's movie time, and then it's like it's a national tragedy, and I'm like, so what I'm trying to get at here is I've seen the kind of war hysteria, and then I've seen the cycle out of that into being anti-war. This war was a lie. So, and then this war starts several months after we've come out of Afghanistan, and all the people, liberals, conservatives alike, I mean, really across the spectrum, immediately go from being happy that the Afghanistan war was over. They consciously are aware that we were lied into those wars. We've been through it. And then, so I'm like, oh, they've learned their lesson. And then they jump right into, like, it's like somebody flipped a switch. Like it's the Matrix, and there's like one of those things in the back of their head, and then they flick the switch, and then they're just talking points in the media trying to get us into another war. So that's been really troubling to see, and that's why I appreciate some of the work you've done and keeping me up to date as well, right?
And if I can just interject for a sec, actually, what's kind of amazing to see about that is usually the war propaganda machine, like you see throughout the Vietnam conflict especially, what the U.S. State Department was putting out to the public was far different than what U.S. intelligence agencies were actually giving to the president. Because, to my understanding, if you look up Larry Johnson, and the few times he's been featured on the Duran, he talks about this issue specifically. But the CIA used to be evenly split between the analytical side and the operational side. So the analytical side, guys that sit in front of computers, they look at radar printouts and I guess scanning. I don't know what to call it, like pictures, like just printed radar pictures.
They're like what the CIA is ostensibly supposed to be.
Yes,
intelligence gathering.
And then
yeah,
and then the operational half are the guys actually going out and getting the Cubans to conduct the Bay of Pigs operation or doing secret assassinations. And, yeah, exactly, right?
Right.
But what happened, I think sometime during, like after the 9/11 panic, is there was literally a wall in the CIA building dividing these two departments that you couldn't go in between. And the wall was knocked down figuratively and literally. So now these departments are completely combined. And what's weird about the Ukraine conflict is with every other conflict that the US has ever been kind of proxy to, they've always had their own intelligence on the ground, gathering their own data. For the Ukraine conflict, they are completely relying on Ukrainian intelligence. So if Ukraine wanted to lie about anything, they absolutely can, and they will not get checked on it, and it'll get parroted throughout the American media like it is absolute fact. And it's crazy because the president of the United States will believe it is absolute fact, even when Telegram channels, live Russians and Ukrainians that are on site, you look at Patrick Lancaster or Graham Phillips that are actually in Ukraine. And they're reporting the complete polar opposite, with video evidence reporting the complete polar opposite of what Ukraine is saying. So I don't know.
It's really crazy to see the brazen lies. Like, a lot of times there's a wall of separation, so to speak, between the lies, and you have that sneaking suspicion because if you've been in the business of politics at all, not to trust the U.S. empire. But there's always that wall of separation, and maybe we'll get a leak here and there, or some truth, redacted documents. But it's been interesting in the digital age seeing this because the news media says one thing. You see it looks all official with the fucking ticker tape at like, oh wow, maybe this is what's going on. And then you'll see on the ground stuff from somebody's fucking phone or from a reputable journalist telling the complete opposite, right?
And what was crazy too, right when the conflict broke out, there was a bunch of footage of, oh look, here's Russia bombing Ukrainian cities, and it was actually footage of the 1999 bombing campaign on Yugoslavia that NATO carried out, and it's like, holy shit, man. That was literally passed off in some, not major outlets, but you had outlets like Daily Telegraph and Daily Mail that people still take seriously. You had some of those outlets try to push that off as real footage.
No, there's a lot of instances of that. Like, they had one of that Palestinian girl cussing down and yelling at an Israeli soldier, and they're pawning that off that was a Ukrainian girl yelling at a Russian soldier. Meanwhile, it's in the fucking deserts of Palestine.
Yeah.
Or there was a lot of instances of they were using like I don't know if the word's virtual reality, but combat or flight simulator game footage, and then passing that off as something that was actually going on. It was completely debunked. You never see retractions from the media.
The Ghost of Kiev is what that.
That was a good one. That was a good one. I was like, really had my fingers crossed they'd do a super cringe Top Gun style movie of that. Man. I was like, this will be. I was like, I'll watch it. Let's see what it's about. You know.
Do you remember the Snake Island thing that went on around that same time as the Ghost of Kiev?
That was the soldiers cussing out the Ukrainians, cussing out the
it was
Russians?
It was this huge victory at the time where Snake Island is literally like a rock with a naval base on it. It can't sustain life. There's maybe 20 people, like military personnel total, it can sustain. And
like a radar station type of place.
Basically. And it was kind of central to the Ukrainian position, so the Russians abandoned it, and then the Ukrainians took it back, and they made this huge media campaign how they stormed Snake Island and took it back, and they had this big battle with the Russian. And you look at this island, they didn't even end up staying on it because Russian artillery got to the point that it's not a sustainable position for anybody.
What are you going to do? Keep it for Iraq? I mean, it's insane. And there's been a lot of tactical sides of this too, where it just seems like a complete boondoggle. But going back to the core, what we were driving at here, the mainstream media lies and propaganda. Now, I have my position on this war, which is it's complicated and it's nuanced how most things should be, right? I very much understand why this war is happening. I understand that it didn't come out of nowhere and that it was due to Russia being provoked, NATO encirclement, all this kind of stuff. But we can get into maybe have you do a quick breakdown for people that are somewhat new to the topic. For me personally, I understand all that, but I'm also super hesitant to be like painting a Z on the front of my house or like being super duper pro-Russian. Granted, I don't know as much about it as you. I guess the point I'm trying to make is I'm just very hesitant to be super pro anything in a war that I understand is a proxy war, and it's not like Russia's some socialist utopia. But I understand the interests. I mean, I know I'm rambling here a bit, but one of the things I've seen, and maybe you can speak to and give me your position, maybe even change my position potentially. See a lot of people that are like super gung-ho pro-Russian about this. I don't know if you feel that that's a warranted reason or a warranted position to have. Maybe they take it a little too far. If there's I don't know if you could speak on that a little bit, what you feel about this. And
the one thing that I always say when people kind of ask me my position is my support always has and always will lie with the people of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic that have had a right to sovereignty since 2014 and since the Minsk II agreements came out, that Angela Merkel has since admitted were a complete farce, but they had referendums.
Give them time to regroup. Essentially is what it was.
Basically.
Right. Okay.
But they had referendums in 2014 for the Donetsk and Luhansk regions to be declared autonomous regions and still stay a part of Ukraine. But Ukraine decided to continue to shell them because they wanted to exert their, how shall we say, anti-Russian policies And by that I mean literally banning the Russian language. They've now banned Russian Orthodox Christianity, Russian history in schools, teaching like any of the actual history of Crimea or those regions that weren't even given to Ukraine until like the 1920s by Lenin. Yeah. So you look before that, their history is Russian history. So they want them to forget all of that. Pick up in 1922 when Lenin gave it to the Ukrainian SFR, and that
whole region.
Yeah, and that's where I think more of the focus needs to be, because a lot of people don't know. Over the course of that 8 years since 2014, Ukraine has been endlessly shelling both of those republics. Schools, hospitals, apartment complexes, all the things they're accusing Russia of doing, which we can get into in a moment.
That's that projection.
Exactly. But they've been doing this for years. When Crimea held its referendum, you can debate the veracity of how these events went down, but there was a public outcry for when the Maidan coup happened in 2014 in Ukraine, and it was primarily fostered. It was a genuine movement at first, but eventually once the US started to stimulate it a bit, how shall we say, we saw a lot of these armed far-right groups prop up, like the Azov Battalion, OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, who is linked to Stefan Bandera, which we can get into again in a minute.
The Banderites.
Yeah, but you had all these organizations come up, and they were suddenly armed, and they were suddenly organized, and they were suddenly militant. And I can send you the top of the doc for this video. There's the general source doc, and if you look, there's a particular far-right ideology in Ukraine that has stuck across since the Second World War. Of that Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists that actually cooperated with a certain regime out of Germany, being sensitive for the YouTube algorithm here. But they had elected mayors, they had put in place laws and all this stuff over the last 8 years that weren't only anti-Russian, but were anti-anything that wasn't what they thought was the Ukrainian identity.
Yeah. Anti-Jew, we saw a lot of them going after Romani people. That's something we've even seen actually escalate going into the war. You've seen Romani people, Jewish people, maybe LGBT people. I feel like I saw something about that, but I don't want to like claim on that necessarily. I can't, fact check it. But where they were tying them to poles, beating them in public humiliation, people that spoke Russian, people that were even using the humanitarian corridors. Yeah, they're using the humanitarian corridors to go towards Russia because maybe they're Russian speaking and have family over there more so than in Western Ukraine. People being assaulted physically. I did some coverage on that as well back when they were when Zelensky announced that no males between 18 and 65 could leave the country. They had border guards, people trying to flee the war, trying to flee the draft. Had them tied up and locked up and things like that. So, so I guess just to give like a little gist on that, would you say you'd say then that you're feeling for the people that you're taking the side rather of the people that have been fighting in Donetsk and Luhansk for the last decade or so, rather than taking one side in a geopolitical proxy? Or
yeah, exactly, because these are the people that, regardless of Putin's intentions, and I really hate to acclimate the entire war effort to Putin because this was a collective decision made by the Russian Security Council that has several members on it, right? Putin is a wise leader. He listens to his advisors. Anyways, these are the people that for 8 years have been trying to come to some compromise with the Ukrainian state, that have tried to find some workaround where they can stay a part of Ukraine, and Ukraine can retain its autonomy, it can gain its Western alliances. Not joining NATO is a red line, but what eventually happened is two very specific events where you have Putin and Biden. I can't remember exactly which conference it was, but it was in December 2021. They basically had a sit-down conversation, and Biden said, don't worry, there's not going to be any missiles in Ukraine. It's not going to happen.
Right.
And Putin said, okay, amazing. I'll send you the paperwork. For weeks and weeks and weeks. Putin sent different versions of a draft treaty, tried to phone him, tried to write him letters, didn't hear anything back. And then literally February, I think up to February 20th, you have the Munich Security Conference where Zelensky is running around asking for nukes and saying that Ukraine will get nukes.
Right.
And no one...
There's supposed to be treaty, like diplomatic negotiations going on to avoid this.
Yeah. And no one is saying anything like, no, actually, no, we're not going to do that, or we need to talk about this further. They were just letting him go. So Putin got to the point that it's like, you fool me once with Romania, Latvia, and Estonia. Shame on me. You fool me twice, you know.
They've been through this many, many times.
Yeah.
And that's something I want to note, too, is that whole playing stupid and making promises, but not actually signing on the dotted line. And as we could also note, even when the U.S. government does sign on the dotted line, it's a load of bullshit. But how many times have leaders sued for peace, and the U.S. has that whole policy of it's pretty much no engagement, no treaties, no diplomatic relations. Like, for instance, with the first Iraq war, I believe, with Saddam Hussein, the Gulf War, he repeatedly sued for peace and sent letters, and it was no, 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 no. He offered to leave Kuwait and things like this, and the U.S. government just refused because they wanted the war. And it's the same sort of scenario here.
Yeah.
But going on with that too, you know, you mentioned at the beginning of this section here that, you know, obviously the mainstream media is painting Putin like this madman and this dictator with complete powers, autocratic powers, and you're referencing that, you know, there's a whole Security Council. What would you say to the idea that Putin is ruling Russia with an iron fist and pushing the entire country into this war, and maybe even, you know, segueing from that, if you'd like, ruminating into some of the maybe loose political structure that's going on in Russia? Like, I know Putin's part of the United Russia Party, but the Communist Party has a pretty large influence there still. Maybe you could dive into those topics a little bit, give me some of your perspective.
I do have limited knowledge to how the Russian system works in whole. You could definitely argue it's authoritarian to a degree, but I would even compare Putin to Stalin, especially, where you can argue he had an authoritarian regime, but Stalin was not a dictator. Stalin had very furious, very rigorous arguments with everybody that was part of the actual Politburo. And I can't remember, I think it was Khrushchev, which was one of Stalin's biggest critics in the end. But he said, say what you will about Stalin, but he is a man that you can sit down and have a fierce argument with and change his mind. And he will turn around and say, I was wrong, you were right, we're going to do this instead. And I would say that's a very similar situation to Putin, where he has a lot of figures around him, like Dmitry Medvedev, that have more military experience, perhaps more diplomatic experience with specific countries, but he listens to these people first and foremost. He listens to Sergei Surovikin before he was replaced. I can't remember the new general's name now. It's just slipping my mind, but...
Sure. It's a lot of names. I've been doing this for years. I still struggle.
Yeah.
You watch my videos, you've seen like, that one guy.
Yeah.
You know,
right.
Go on.
But that's the important thing, is that like you can see there's a specific meeting Putin has with, I think it's the head of transportation, or basically the guy that's in charge of manufacturing a bunch of aircrafts. And Putin is asking very specific questions. He knows this factory director told me he hasn't gotten the order yet. I just spoke to him before this meeting, and you're telling me he has that order. That is absolute bullshit. So he does have kind of a role that a general secretary in a communist party has. I'm not saying he's a Marxist or he even is playing that same role, but he is taking a decisive hand in industry, but more in a guiding sense. So when he has his heads of industry and he has all these big meetings and conferences, he listens to the heads of business and what they're projecting, what their production capacities are, what they think the best options are, their timelines. He's not just going around like, we get this idea of a dictator being like, nope, everything's gonna be like this and this and this and this. And sure, even if someone has that level of control, it is very, very rare that they actually take on that role that you could call a dictator. Like, most often they make more nominal decisions. They write the speeches, but most of the decisions on the ground level on how many tanks are going to be produced, which attack is going to take where, that is completely out of Putin's hands. Putin says, sure, okay, now we're going to take this war seriously, because everybody on his security council and all the military generals were begging him to actually call up men and why can't I remember the word? What is it called when men are called up?
Conscripts?
But what is the process
Mobilized?
called? Mobilization, yes.
Mobilization.
When he called for the mobilization, Russian generals had been asking for that for months, and he waited and waited because he didn't want to aggravate the West too far.
Yeah.
And he eventually,
there's a lot of PR involved with that too.
Yeah, like it's ironic. Like, people think that Putin has this big criticism from inside of Russia, that he's waging this war against Ukraine and that he's just there on this imperialistic endeavor to gain more land. But you actually look at internal opinion polls, even conducted by Western institutes, and more people are aggravated that Putin didn't go in fast enough and he didn't go in hard enough, and that they're still fighting there. Is more so their issue. It's not that the fighting is there to begin with, because as we can.
So you would say,
go ahead.
Would you say that the people in Russia now, obviously we've seen some anti-war demonstrations, and I mean that's great. I mean, I think every society should always have at least some, knows, no matter what the nature of the war is, right? But would you make the case or say that, generally speaking, the population in Russia has an understanding that this war was necessary to a degree? Maybe they wouldn't agree with all how it went down, or maybe they would have argued for trying some other things first. But would you say, what I'm trying to say is, would you say that the people of Russia have a general understanding of why this is happening and see it as somewhat necessary?
So what I've heard is a lot. I'm going to point towards a specific interview with the Duran that they just had a couple days ago, with a gentleman that actually lives in Russia, and they've had quite a few interviews from people living in Russia. And Alexander Makuris has also read reports from Westerners that have gone to Moscow. I think one of the important factors to consider is, yes, absolutely, the anti-war protests were suppressed, and that's the authoritarian part of the Russian regime.
I think that's important for people to hear, because one of the things I want to touch on too is that I think people maybe fetishize Russia a bit much. Yeah. I don't know what that's about, but anyway, go on.
I definitely, I'll get to my opinion on Russia as a whole, but there are definitely issues within Russian, I guess the way their political structure works, maybe as a leftover of the old days of the Soviet Union. The first thing is a lot of the more liberal-minded Russians, people that were hyper-focused on any kind of Western good or Western lifestyle, a lot of those people ended up moving to Georgia and parts of Eastern Europe as the conflict started to break out and as the sanctions started to roll in. And gradually, over time, the people that were against the war, mainly because of the suppression of the anti-war protests, their voices just got a little bit quieter and quieter. And then two important things happened. Angela Merkel came out and said that the Minsk II Accords were complete bullshit. No one was going to hold Ukraine to anything. And for the viewers that don't know what that is, that was during, shortly after the Maidan coup, and there was a bit of violent unrest in Ukraine. Russia took a hold of Crimea. That's a separate topic. But the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, the majority Russian-speaking republics, they were Russian Orthodox Christians, they were more Russians than they were Ukrainian, they held referendums and said they did not want to be governed by this new Ukrainian government. And Minsk was upheld by Germany, Britain, France, were supposed to be all these guarantors that would assure this peace and that this political process would be conducted to declare the future status of these regions, and it just never happened. Ukraine continued to shell the regions. They held their referendums, and they were completely ignored.
Yes, like we talked about, yep.
So it goes back, and then once that's admitted, and the Russian people see that was a gift for the Russian state, for Angela Merkel to come out and say that the Minsk II was a complete joke, because now they have proof that what Putin and Medvedev were saying, that this is a conflict between the West and Russia, is almost proven, and that they were given a green light for Ukraine to attack Russia and to agitate Russian citizens in this way. And then the second thing that happened is a specific Ukrainian official came out and said the peace negotiations that happened in Istanbul in March, what a lot of people get this misconception of is that during the beginning of this war, Putin tried to take Kiev and he couldn't do it because the Russian military is so weak, it's so disorganized, blah, blah, blah. But you look at... Sorry? Dated, yeah.
Dated military equipment structures. Yep.
And you just look at the number of troops that were sent to Kiev and the number of troops that were sent to, say, Donetsk City, a city of an eighth of the population of Kiev. And it was relatively the same amount of troops.
Yeah.
So you're telling me Russia was conducting a serious offensive on the capital of the country with the same amount of troops that it's using for an isolated city in an isolated oblast that's completely to the east of Ukraine.
Right.
What it was actually intended to do, and what it was doing up until the peace negotiations broke down, is drive Ukraine to the negotiating table.
Sure.
And that is what happened in March. And during those negotiations, as a measure of good faith, the troops were withdrawn from Kiev.
Right.
After the troops were withdrawn, the peace negotiations were blown up. Boris Johnson shows up to Ukraine. All of a sudden, all the peace negotiations are tanked, and we're back to square one. So at that point, the Russians go back to the drawing board. Outside of Kiev, actually, even up until... And as I was saying, is what happened in March after Russia pulled its troops back as a gesture of good faith during the Istanbul peace negotiations, the fighting kind of continued on at a somewhat tempered pace. Most of the Russian standard army that were there were contract soldiers that were coming to the end of their contract by, say, about August, September. But most of the fighting was carried out by members of the militias of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, as well as the Chechen militia, the Wagner forces as well. A lot of it wasn't, up until September, October, a lot of it wasn't Russian forces on the ground. Russia has provided air support, intelligence support, artillery support, but a lot of the actual fighting on the ground has been done by the people of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic, the people that have been
in that region, correct?
Yeah, and the people that have been fighting for 8 years, those are the people that are still fighting to this day.
Right.
And that's why my support lies there with those people, because they're fighting their struggle for independence and just their right to live and practice their culture that they've had for hundreds of years. So
Right, and have some semblance of autonomy and sovereignty, able to make their own decisions.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we kind of want to keep back on with the script here a little bit, do you want to take us, on a little bit of a narrative journey or a timeline, starting from where we left off with the peace negotiations in Istanbul that obviously hit a brick wall due to Western interference? You want to take us on from that, like what sort of happened when the siege of Kiev fell apart, and leading up to maybe this sort of quote unquote stalemate that the Western media is calling it, and maybe going from there?
Yeah, for sure. I'll do the best I can. I'm sure I'll leave out some key events. But basically since March, the fighting has just kind of petered on at a steady pace. Like I said, by about the point of August, September, a lot of the contract soldiers in the Russian Standard Army were starting to return back home. And again, that's why the mobilization was called at that point. But there were a few Russian gains in a few towns, and Ukrainian counter advances as well, two in particular, Kherson and Kharkiv region. Kherson is particularly interesting because It was shortly after Sergei Surovikin was appointed to head the Russian forces in Ukraine, and there was a lot of talk of whether or not the Russians were actually going to pull out of Kherson. One of the biggest kind of indicators is they started to remove a lot of Soviet monuments and a lot of important Russian kind of iconographies and figures, almost as if they were getting prepared to abandon the city. But they left no indication of whether or not they were going to do it. They are still fighting pretty rigorously up until the point that they actually retreated. And even the Western media is coming to the point that they're agreeing. You look at Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis talk about this as well. Colonel Douglas McGregor as well.
I've heard some of him.
Right.
Yeah.
But Russia was able to completely withdraw its forces without suffering very heavy losses at all, while actually inflicting really heavy losses onto Ukraine. And
Calculated retreat.
Exactly. And which is kind of opposed to the Ukrainian strategy that has been keep every bit of territory that you possibly can, no matter what the cost. Mm-hmm. Where Russia has showed it values human life, especially trained, experienced military personnel's life, opposed to what's currently going on in Bakhmut. But
that sounds, from that point of view, that really sounds like the strategy of a dying man or a man backed into the corner. You know what I'm trying to say? Where it's it's caution to the wind, hold on to every scrap, no matter what it costs. That does not sound like the sound military practice of a military engine that has like a long game in this.
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying to say? Like it feels like they're just swinging at what they can swing at for the sake of PR to keep arms and munitions rolling in. And
exactly.
I don't know. It just doesn't sound good.
Ukraine is fighting a PR war and the Russians are fighting a military war. Like you can't even compare the approaches so far. Like it's been so vastly different. Like you look at as those offensives in Kherson and Kharkov were taking place, where Ukraine were making these very modest gains of territory. To this day, Kherson city is still under Russian bombardment and hasn't been under operational Ukrainian control since they've entered the city. But concurrently happening around the city of Bakhmut, or Artyomovsk is what the Russians call it, the Wagner forces have been gradually grinding down the Ukrainian forces since about August, September, October. And they've very slowly, through artillery strikes, through suicide drone strikes, recon analysis, they've picked out Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian air defense positions, very gradually. They've not once have conducted any kind of human wave tactics, contrary to what the Western media wants to say. Like, I just read a report that this weekend, apparently Russia lost 2,000 soldiers. According to a Western media outlet, despite the fact that the BBC said that according to their best calculations, they can count 12, maybe 13,000 dead Russians. So that excludes the LPR, DPR, Chechen forces. But so they estimate maybe 20,000 Russian losses total throughout this whole conflict, through the whole conflict. And you're telling me just this weekend? Well, Russia is operationally encircled. Yeah. Well, while they're on the upper hand, even according to Western analysts, Russia has the upper hand right now. And somehow they've lost more men in this weekend than like any period in the entire conflict. Like I don't see how that logic carries over in a lot of the way. But I guess I'm kind of getting off what I was saying.
No, that's okay. That's okay. So we're at this position where we're talking about these counteroffenses, right? In the wake of the calculated Russian retreat. And then what kind of goes on? Where are we still sort of in that deadlock? Obviously, the counteroffenses themselves are kaput.
Yeah, they're basically ground to a halt. The one in Kharkov, I believe, went a little further, but as soon as it ran into a Russian force that was ready to stand and fight, it went absolutely nowhere. So as Russia kind of slowly and gradually recuperated its forces, started to integrate some of the mobilized forces, because one thing to understand too about the mobilized forces is Russians have conscription to begin with. So usually they do a year or two of military service unless they're mentally or physically unfit. As well, throughout high school and middle school, they learn a lot of skills like welding and a lot of vocational skills that carry over into the military. So when they're calling up 300,000 men of army age, they've all had military experience of some degree. So some of these guys may have been people that were just rotated out. Some of these guys have experience in the Syrian conflict. Some of these people have experience in conflict in Africa. Some of these guys are almost green, like they've done a couple years maybe serving in the equivalent of the Russian National Guard. So as these forces are mobilized, you have groups of the forces that can go on the battlefield within a month, 2 months, 3 months after they're trained within their battalion and they're more accustomed to the new formations, and then they can be ready to go in. But then you have all these forces that they're going to take months to train up on how to actually conduct themselves on the battlefield with other units and armored units and recon units. And I don't know very much about the military specifics. Like Brian Berletic of the New Atlas is really great for that kind of stuff. But now we've kind of gotten to the point where Russia is at least starting something that resembles an offensive. Bakhmut has been continuously shelled and attacked, but now Russia has almost operationally encircled Bakhmut. If you look on liveuamap.com, you can see the city of Bakhmut, and both to the north and south, Russian forces are conducting a pincer movement to create what they call a cauldron. So basically encircle the forces in Bakhmut so they have no way to leave, no way to come in, there's no supplies that can come in, no troops that can leave, and it's the same thing that happened in Mariupol a couple months ago.
That's what I was going to ask, if it was something similar to that.
It's a very similar thing. And then you have Solidar, that the Ukrainian forces just admitted fell, but that fell some 2 weeks ago to the Russian forces, and that, I believe, is to the north of Bakhmut. And you also have Vuhledar, which I'm mispronouncing that a little bit, but the fight is ongoing for Vuhledar, and that is to the south of Bakhmut, and that would help the Russian forces complete encirclement of Bakhmut, going into Chasiv Yar, which is a city to the west of Bakhmut as well. And then on top of that, you have in the Zaporozhye region, you have Russian forces steadily advancing there. You have around Donetsk city, you have a large Russian force advancing there as well. So really, we're kind of ending the stalemate, and we're on to a point where not necessarily the momentum is turning, but the Russians are on the advance instead of a mobile defense.
Sure. Would you maybe describe it as a greasing of the wheels for something larger to come, especially as these reinforcements start getting folded into the actual mechanism of the war? Like maybe, greasing the way, putting the infrastructure in place, the basis for more forward operations when the supply chains and amounts of troops comes in. Is that like maybe a good way to look at it?
Yeah, that's one of the things I've heard. I can't remember if it was Scott Ritter, or Colonel Douglas McGregor, but they were talking about an offensive that's more so to shape the battlefield itself and to get everything into position for your actual big offensive. So that could very well be what this is. Like, you look at Bakhmut, and it's centrally located and is basically a supply hub for most of the Ukrainian positions along what they call the Zelensky line. And that's a line that since 2014 has been reinforced and built up in anticipation for a Russian offensive. And that basically sits on the border of Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Luhansk, and the Kherson regions. And effectively, once Bakhmut falls, there's not many positions the Ukrainians can continue to retreat to that they can hold. So the Ukrainians say that Bakhmut isn't that important. Its fall won't be that important. And yet, despite reports from the U.S. Pentagon that they're actively telling the Zelensky regime to retreat from Bakhmut to move to what we call a mobile defense, so defending on the move. And despite Ukraine saying that Bakhmut isn't all that important, they've thrown endless amounts of men and endless amounts of machinery into defending Bakhmut. And
for this one area.
Yeah. And we're getting to the point now where even, like I say, Western analysts, like people 2-3 weeks ago, were saying Ukraine is winning, when is Russia going to give up, blah, blah, blah. They're now talking about how Ukraine is on the back foot and needs to pull out of Bakhmut, and they don't understand why Ukraine isn't pulling out of Bakhmut. And actually, you listen to Alexander Makuris, and he's been saying that for 3 months now. So
right. Do you think so? If this spring offensive happens, you got 300,000, conscripts coming to the front line, all these chess pieces on the map that they've been working the last few months to kind of secure. What do you think that this spring offensive is going to look like? Like, is it going to be a quick execution and this war could end? Do you think, what does it look like? Will Ukraine capitulate? Will they try to go back to the diplomacy table? Will the U.S. stop that? I mean, in your mind's eye, in your imagination, what are you kind of seeing? What are some eventualities?
There's quite a few different possibilities here. Obviously, I'm not a member of the Russian Security Council. I'm not privy to their plans, so I don't really know for certain. But
brother, if you were, the feds would be kicking down my door.
Yeah, I bet me too. Even up here in the Great White North. You look at the recent purge that's happened throughout the Ukrainian government, and Zelensky's spin doctor, I can't remember his name right now, Arestovich, I want to say is his name, but basically he got fired because he said there was a specific missile that fell on an apartment building in Dnipro. And he said, no, it was a Ukrainian missile that we tried to fire at a Russian missile. And I believe he said it was the Kim Jong missile, which is a supersonic missile that no one has the technology to shoot down right now. So it's kind of far-fetched that they were trying to shoot that down in the first place, but that's the story. And that's what
incompetence is possible.
Right. But that's what this guy was saying. And that the rocket either missed or it exploded on impact, and some of the debris fell on this apartment building, that it wasn't the Russians striking the apartment building. And he got sacked for that. And he's been there since the day one of the war, basically turning anything Zelensky says and making it positive. Anything happening in the war, he turns it positive. And he's come out and said that Bakhmut is doomed to fall to the Russians, that there's a lot of issues inside not only the Ukrainian military, but the Ukrainian economy. Wow. You have a lot of generals coming out, German generals, American generals, British generals, saying that the war effort in Ukraine is absolutely unsustainable. The British defense minister actually just resigned shortly before, I believe it was Ramstein that just happened, where they agreed to send the tanks to Ukraine. The German defense minister resigned before that because she drew that hard red line of we're not sending tanks to Ukraine. So they just go on. They just replaced her with someone that was going to walk lockstep with the whole plan.
Yeah. Isn't that the nature of imperial politics? Get on board or get off the boat. It's your choice. You can swim.
We'll find another lapdog that'll do exactly what you want.
There's always somebody.
So
it's always funny to me when these people quit, because it's like,
they think they're going to change something, right? Making a stand or something.
Like, homie, you're just the paycheck guy. I don't know. Go on.
You're just the name on a page.
Exactly.
But, so the couple possibilities in general that I see, what the U.S. Pentagon wants the Ukrainian forces to do right now is, like I said, go on mobile defense, wait off on any counteroffensive, build up their reserves, build up their training, get trained on all this new equipment, the Bradley fighting vehicles, the Marder fighting vehicles, the Leopard 2 tanks, the Challenger 2 tanks, the Abrams tanks. And I don't think Ukraine can do that. I don't think the Zelensky regime can sustain a significant loss of a city like Bakhmut, because people have been asking, like, there was a cry, or a plea, I guess I should say, that went out from, it was the Ukrainian Nurses Association or something like that, that the forces need to pull out of Bakhmut, that it is a horrific amount of deaths. Like, I've seen reports that say hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers dead per day.
Well, if you're pinned down in this single location, you have columns of forces coming at you for both ends, endless bombardment. Hard to imagine anything else.
And that's what shocks me is when they try to spin these narratives like it's the Russians taking massive losses. It's like, that makes absolutely no sense. They have them surrounded. They're taking their time. They have for 6 months. It's not like the Russian general just decided today, oh, I'm gonna launch a huge human wave campaign against this city, and I don't care about the loss of life.
Japanese bonsai.
Yeah, but the Russian generals have said several times that they value human life, or especially Russian military life, over anything, and they will give up territory to reserve fighting power. So I think the Russians at this point aren't going to settle for any less than going all the way to Odessa, so they can get a connection all the way into Transnistria, which is a Soviet enclave that, to my understanding, still has a lot of Soviet armaments built up in it. The second thing is you have...
Before you go on to that second thing, what would that, if the offensive in the spring spearheads into that, what would that mean for the broader conflict? I'm not a military strategist and I'm not as well educated. Does that bring it to an end? Does that push Ukraine into a certain position where they'd have to capitulate, or?
Well, here's the question is, from an objective viewpoint, from the outside looking in, Ukraine has been at the point of capitulation, at least in my opinion, for a month or two now. And these piecemeal deliveries they're getting of armored vehicles and tanks, and some of which aren't even going to show up for a year or two on the battlefield, it's really not going to be enough to make up for the loss of thousands and thousands of tanks that they started this conflict with. Like, they try to project this narrative that they've destroyed 3,600 Russian tanks and they've captured hundreds of them, but they're going around begging for more tanks that we were saying months ago weren't fit for the battlefield in Ukraine, that the Ukrainian soldiers weren't trained on and weren't a good fit for this conflict. That was the whole reason we got former Warsaw Pact nations to give their Soviet-era tanks to Ukraine. But now we're turning around and saying, yeah, we're giving the tanks to Ukraine, even though they're winning and even though they've captured all these Russian tanks. Like, it just doesn't add up. So
yeah,
it's going to get to, in my opinion, we're looking at a complete collapse of the Ukrainian military. Like, you have General Zaluzhny, which is the head of the Ukrainian military, and there's been several reports. It's hard to verify the veracity of them, but several times he's butted heads directly with Zelensky, particularly over Bakhmut. He butted heads with him over Soledar. He's currently butting heads with him over Vuhledar, over the issue of just pulling the troops out. That Bakhmut is lost. When Soledar was lost, he was trying to convince Zelensky of that, but Zelensky didn't want to give up an inch of territory until he had to. So you're going to get to a point where the Ukrainian forces just don't have enough men to replenish their forces. Like, there's another mobilization run in Ukraine, but I don't know who they have left that's of military age that isn't fighting in the military or providing a vital logistical role for the military. So,
and if they sense this area that you're talking about that has like an old munitions cache of Soviet era stuff that they actually are trained and capable of using, that's going to be a huge upset as well. Because they've already so limited on supplies. We're talking about, not being able to, mobilize in an efficient way anything that the West is sending. That's why, like you said, they were having former Warsaw Pact nations send in stuff. If you lose a huge arms depot with all the infrastructure and equipment there like that, that's not going to be good either.
Well, Transnistria is actually, if I understand correctly, is a part of Moldova. And they don't have access. Like, Transnistria is treated as its own country, basically. It's an enclave nation. It's a remnant of Soviet times. It's a very weird kind of... politically, it's in a very weird spot. The Ukrainians don't have access to those arms currently, no. I'm sure NATO would love to get those arms into the hands of Ukrainians, but...
Okay, that makes sense.
But the big thing about Russia getting to Odessa is that completely landlocks Ukraine. So when you're talking about the future of Ukraine and any kind of economic future for Ukraine, that eliminates the possibility of Ukraine being a self-sustaining state. to any degree of the word. And you look at the core objectives of the special military operation, one of them being demilitarization. A big part of that is going to be cutting off Ukraine's access to the Sea of Azov, to the Black Sea, and to the Mediterranean, right? Is keeping them landlocked. And what I think is actually more likely to happen is, this is the second point I was going on. You look at the forces building up in Poland, and it's a force of some 100,000 troops that are being mobilized and built up on the Polish border. Putin has more than once spoken of the region of Western Ukraine. It's called Galicia throughout history. And this particular region of Ukraine is the particularly nationalistic region. That's where Stefan Bandera is from. That's where a lot of these right-wing movements are from. These people are fundamentally anti-Russian. They do not like anything Russian. They will never accept being ruled by the Russians. And Putin has...
the heartland of Ukraine, so to speak.
And more so, ironically, these people identify closely with the Polish people, because those are actually the lands that ended up being given to Ukraine in 1945 after the Second World War ended. Because that was the part of Poland that was split up to the Soviet Union in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Right, okay. Yep.
And that region ended up going to Ukraine, and you end up having a lot of this nationalistic, fundamentalist kind of far right ideology in that region. And there was, I was looking for this, and I couldn't find out who it was, but it was a Russian diplomat in the time of the Tsar that said, so before the Russian Revolution, like we're talking 1800s, they said, if you want to destroy Ukraine, unite it with Galicia. And Putin has...
I remember you discussing that with me, yeah.
Putin has alluded to that comment specifically. Putin has alluded to the fact that those people might be more comfortable being ruled by the Polish. So I think what we might see is the Poles coming in with these Leopard 2 tanks that they're trained on, Challenger 2s and Abrams that they're maybe not trained on, but... these Leopard 2 tanks that are being sent to Ukraine that are going to have to be staged in Poland anyways, that probably won't get there for a year or two. And if Ukraine is lucky, they have another year left in this conflict.
Yeah.
So the plan may be to have Poland go into Western Ukraine and for Russia to take the rest of Ukraine. The one issue with that is Lukashenko of Belarus has said specifically he will not tolerate the Poles in Western Ukraine. And with Belarus and Russia officially signing, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but they function as a cohesive military state now. So if you you attack one, you attack the other. So
that's the sort of idea I've gotten just from, this stage of the war so far, and the sort of interlinkings politically between those two countries.
So the problem is, if the Poles go into Western Ukraine and Belarus wants to attack the Poles, now you're talking about a NATO country being attacked directly by Russia and Belarus, a NATO country that is waiving Article 5 because it's not defending its own territory, but still a NATO country nonetheless.
This is an instance where you could see this spiraling into a global conflict, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, is there... Okay, so how real is that threat of this spiraling into World War III? Because, I've seen a lot of comparisons to the sort of interlocking political alliances, NATO, all this stuff. I've seen loose comparisons to the sort of lead up to World War I, right? That caused that to break out into a world war. There's some inklings like that. Do you think it's a real serious threat that something like that will happen, that'll spiral out of control? Do you see a point where the U.S. draws the line and cuts their losses? I mean, for all the blustering out of the United States, it's pretty clear that I think the U.S. would be hesitant to mobilize their own American forces. We've kind of learned the lesson of U.S. people, as pro-imperialist as they can be. They're pretty hesitant on a draft and things like this. Is there any lines where this stops and the U.S. cuts it down and it doesn't spiral out of control? Or
well, that's kind of the question, right? Because you look at
Right.
Vietnam, and it started off with the U.S. sending guns and eventually heavy arms, vehicles, and tanks to the South Vietnamese forces, and then it turned into, a lot of these weapons are being siphoned off and sold on the black market, so we're just going to have U.S. advisors there, which they have in Ukraine right now as well, but people on the ground that are non-combatant but are U.S. forces, kind of just observing and being in some kind of control. And then you have the US taking on the reconnaissance and the intelligence role of the Ukrainian military. You have Elon Musk Starlink, for example. Even though that's a private entity, you have American entities already fully invested in Ukraine. Of course, BlackRock and all those, Lockheed Martin, all those great ones as well. But it's going in that very same trajectory that Vietnam was, where eventually boots were put on the ground. And the issue is Alexander Mercouris talks about this all the time, and this is actually a phrase he coined that I think is perfect. We are on the escalatory escalator. It is going up, and there's no stopping it. The neocons have no reverse gear. The war hawks in America,
these people are mad.
Yeah, they have no reverse gear. They're so out of touch. Like I was saying earlier in the program, how the U.S. intelligence community is completely cut off from the political class, at least in the sense that the people doing the genuine analysis, they're ostracized from the intelligence community. The intelligence community is parroting what the U.S. State Department wants to hear. It's not giving it genuine, honest intelligence that, even if it's contrary to U.S. foreign policy interests, it's the truth of what's actually happening. That no longer happens. So it is broken down to the point that these politicians are blindly agreeing to these things, and they're blindly going along with this policy like it's no issue. But you do see the RAND Corporation and CSIS both coming out with studies. These are big neoconservative think tanks that are basically saying, we don't have enough left in the tank for Ukraine and Taiwan. We need to pull the plug on Ukraine so we can move on to Taiwan. Much like they had to pull the plug on Afghanistan to then move on to Ukraine. So, what's interesting is this has really shown how bad the U.S. military-industrial complex has really become, how emaciated it really is. Like, you look at the U.S. reports saying that they've given up on matching the Russians for artillery production. Like, we mentioned this earlier, but
Isn't this supposed to be the one thing we're good at is war? Like, what's going on, man?
You spend all your money on this and to not have health care, and there's jokes like, oh, this country's going to find out why we don't have universal health care, right? Like, if they come to war with us. But
that's the only thing that was keeping me going, is that we were good at killing people, man. That's depressing.
Right? According to Western statistics, I'm looking at this right now, a Washington Street Journal report. Ukraine fires 40,000 artillery shells a month, where Russian forces fire 20,000 a day. That is not even close, and the U.S. has given up on matching Russia for artillery. The Western sources estimate that America is producing, can get up to 100,000 artillery shells in a year, production terms. Russia is at 3.4 million. Yeah. So this whole conflict has exposed how weak the actual U.S. military-industrial complex is. And you have these Patriot missile systems, these HIMARS missile systems being given to Ukraine, but you have countries like Saudi Arabia, Japan, Taiwan. They don't have enough for their stocks and for their HIMARS missile launchers and their Patriot missile launchers, and the U.S. is busy sending this all to Ukraine, and now you have several, I'll send you the links, they're in the doc, but you have these several think tanks coming out and saying the U.S. can't sustain this anymore.
Yeah, some of the stuff I might try to like take screenshots and clip in as we're doing this discussion for the viewers, because it is just mind-boggling, you know, and this gets to the discussion about the differences between, you know, the global economic order right now, like the powerhouses in the economy. Like, what's the difference? You've got China, that's the workshop of the world, and then you've got Russia that in the last decade or so has really tried to undo shock therapy and rejected neoliberal capitalism towards a more state-oriented industrial capitalist society. And then you've got the United States. Like, well, let's be honest, what is it? It's a giant fucking paperwork casino, man. And it's just all artificial bloat and crapshoots on the Wall Street Stock Exchange, and
it's all funny made up numbers on computers.
It's insane.
Is all it is.
It really is just mind boggling. And then we all, and I'm rambling here a bit, but like we're all just living in this late stage capitalist hell where there's no decent jobs. It's wait tables, stock shelves, sell people fucking slop for food. And if you're lucky, you got a nice white collar job for some firm that you don't even know what it does. You crop out the data. Like, you ever seen Office Space? You ever seen that movie? Yeah. Like that's the American dream now, is this cubicle. And what is it? It's not worth anything. And like you said, this war is really exposing the productive capacities and really how completely hollowed out and rotten through the U.S. economy and the empire is.
And that's why I think a lot of Western politicians going into this conflict, like their plan was basically aggravate Russia to the point that it's going to make a move, launch a sanctions war against Russia. And you can actually read a Rand Corporation study, the same corporation that did the study saying they need to pull out now. They have a study saying that if you launch a sanctions campaign against Russia, you can try to bring down its economy. That was back in 2019. But anyways, the West was under this impression that like I said before the program, I believe, but they're under the impression that Russia's economy was just 2 gas stations and a trench coat parading itself around. And as soon as sanctions hit, that the Russian economy would crumble. And now we're in a situation where the Russian economic outlook is significantly better than any nation in the West. And the West is actually crumbling, facing skyrocketing energy and food prices, looking at a heavy recession, massive layoffs, while Russia is doing the exact polar opposite. And the Western politicians assumed that Russia's economy was just like theirs and would have crumbled if it had no outside access. So now they have no idea what they're doing. They've just have their foot on the gas pedal, and they have no idea where the brake pedal even is.
I agree, and I think they were so used to the neo-colonial capitalist order, just being able to put them sanctions on, and everyone bends to their will.
Yep.
They're living in that era still, and it's no longer a reality. Because while they were busy gambling, like I said, on the stock exchange and tanking the economy with asset bubbles, the rest of the world was developing their economy in a way that's actually genuine development, right? Unevenly in a lot of ways, and certainly not perfect, certainly still capitalist, exploitative, but just actually an economy.
Yeah.
And
as much as you can criticize Russia for, you can't criticize it for its lack of an industrial base. Like, the one thing, the reason Putin is so hated in the West is because he came in after Boris Yeltsin, who was a complete drunk. He had barely any idea what was going on through his whole reign. He was half asleep the entire time until basically the end of it, and he realized that he allowed the West to destroy and plunder all of the riches of Russia, all the natural resources, all the industry, and he kind of came to this realization at the end of his term that he really fucked up, and that the only person around him that didn't take any of these corruption deals, that wasn't in bed with the West, the only person that was a true Russian patriot was Vladimir Putin. So when Putin came into power, all the Western powers assumed, oh, hey, he's going to just be the same as Yeltsin, and he's going to let us do whatever we want. And yes, Putin is still a capitalist pig, if we want to call him that, but he at the very least,
bourgeois dog.
Yes, right. At the very least, kept the wealth in the hands of Russian people. He focused on Russian oligarchs, his Russian friends, and regardless of what you want to say about that, that's why Russia is in a position that it is mobilizing its economy for war, where the U.S. is barely keeping up with Russia's daily shell production. So,
what economy are you going to mobilize?
Exactly. There's no more skilled labor in the U.S. at all. It barely exists.
No, no, it's crazy, and that's a whole discussion. And sometime I'd like to have you on again just to discuss some of this, just to kind of free ball and talk about some of this stuff, man, because it is just crazy. Like we won't even pay for our people to go to college, brother. Like something you might not know about me, I wanted to be a school teacher. I wanted to teach history and government. And look what I'm fucking doing. I'm doing YouTube for a handful of people on the internet.
Hey, man.
You know, that's a waste of talent. And I ain't saying I'm some fucking grand guy, but I could be bettering my community and my society, but here I am.
I'm in the same boat. I would be in education if there wasn't such a financial barrier around it.
Yeah, it's a class gateway. It's sick. And you don't now. There's still issues with access to education and things in these other countries, but at least there's some effort.
Yeah.
On the basis of the reality that it's necessary to have a modern economy with educated people. At least there's some effort to do something about it and to invest in that human capital, and it just doesn't even exist here. It's crazy.
Well, because we tacitly allowed corporations to deindustrialize the West. As China modernized and as India modernized and all these countries came up with relatively cheap labor, all these countries looked outwards. They looked at the profit. The profit margin was the only thing they cared about. They didn't care about the long term of actually having a secure economic base that can afford to buy your products. That doesn't matter. We're going to make the most money possible. And then that rolled into free lunch. And that rolled into getting rid of vocational programs out of high schools, easy access to like trades careers, and just all these barriers even to any kind of higher earning position in society, to the point that it's almost, especially in a lot of the states, like I know it's a little better here in Canada, but it's almost impossible to go to a post-secondary school and not be completely bankrupt by the end of it.
Yeah, man. Like, I had a kid really young, 19. She was born when I just turned 20, and I had to grind 60 hours a week at a factory, go part-time to school. It took me 3 years to get an AA, and I was already $10,000 in debt, exhausted.
Yeah.
My kids I'm missing my kid's life, you know? And so I opted to I didn't have another 3 years to put my life on hold.
Yeah.
And I couldn't justify putting all this debt on to what? Teach, if I'm lucky, teach at a high school and make under just above poverty.
Yeah. Well, and that's why, like, Cuba, despite being a third world country where people aren't rich by any sense, but that's why Cuba is able to export doctors. They're able to send their doctors abroad to help other countries because people don't have that barrier to education. And when they have a passion for something, when they want to do something, they can just pursue it. That's the same as the DPRK. That's a much deeper conversation to have, but I know like China still and Russia still has a lot of issues with like debt and the same kind of woes we have being in a late stage capitalist system, but they both exercise more state control to the point that the effects of these things are mitigated. They're not life altering. You're not having a child and then getting home with a $200,000 hospital bill that basically means you have to declare bankruptcy and go live under a bridge. Like,
brother, I got a $23,000 bill when my daughter was born. Now there are assets and things you can do to get rid of it. Maybe there was then. That was 10 years ago. Dude, I almost fainted. I'm not kidding you. I opened it, saw that tag at the bottom, and I had to sit down on the kitchen dining room table chair, you know? So
I couldn't imagine, man. Like, I actually got a similar bill because I spent some time in the mental hospital for about 2 months a couple years ago, and I guess they didn't have my health care,
mental health,
right? But they didn't have.
That's a real bad.
But they didn't have my correct healthcare card or something. So they thought I lived, because my dad moved to BC, but I was still living in Alberta. So they thought I was a BC resident, but used Alberta healthcare. And I got a bill for it was maybe 6,000, 7,000 for 2 months. So even if you had to pay in the Canadian system, it's not even close.
Right. No, it just with the mental health stuff too. It's like, hey, we know you're having a crisis, but anytime you could take care of this, 10 G's, be greatly appreciated. So.
But at least in
but
Canada, that stuff is covered. So
no, yeah, it's night and day, man. I mean, brother, I got to tell you, and we're getting off topic here, and we should probably round it off here soon, and
yeah,
maybe we can do another episode or whatever. But just to be in personal, real with you, man. Like I've lived in poverty my whole life in this country, and I can't really even tell you, man, like how hard this country is on people. I mean, I'm not even 30. I feel like I'm fucking 40 years old, brother. I'm getting super personal here, man, but it's just tough, dude.
yeah.
I feel aged in my face. I don't know. It's just super hard on people. I've seen every amount of mental health crisis and drug abuse, and I don't know if you see some of my posts, but I just lost another friend to overdose in this country because it's just the hellscape, man. And I don't know, but this is why we're on here talking about these things and fighting back. And
well, I mean, it's so fucking wild that so many people watch what's happening around us, and it all comes down to a lack of class consciousness and a lack of an actual vanguard party properly disseminating propaganda. But so many people are just under the impression that it's this immigrant community, or it's gay people, or it's this person, it's that person, when ultimately it's the people that control everything and run everything that have ruined everything. That is the logical thing. They are the people that are responsible. They are the ones that made those decisions. They are the ones that got us where we are today. It's not boomers. It wasn't all of our grandparents, because guess what? Our grandparents had the same say in their political system that we do today. They can show up every 4 years and check off a box, or maybe go hold a sign out in front of a legislative building and hope that they get noticed. That is the political process in the West. That is democracy.
That's bourgeois democracy.
Yes, exactly. Bourgeois liberal democracy. But
it's not real, man.
And it inflames me to no point when I see people that are so focused on the wrong things, that are so focused, like, don't get me wrong, the shit that happened with Epstein is absolutely terrible, and I want to see that guy brought to justice, but the amount of focus people put on that...
That's a symptom.
Yeah, it's a symptom.
That's a symptom. Epstein and these power mongers, these elites, those are the symptom. And you could get rid of them and replace them with, probably, as we've seen in the case of like Nazi Germany, Weimar, they'll scapegoat these liberal elites, and then you get fascist elites, and they're just as bad, if not fucking worse. Yeah. But you're getting a new form of elite under the same type of fucking system. This is what being a radical is about, brother. Radical, the Latin root of radical is getting at the root. Yeah. Not cutting the fucking bulbs off the plant. You get at the root. What's the root? Capitalism, imperialism, neocolonialism. Everything else is stemmed out of that, right? Yeah. This war is because of that.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I try to assert whenever I can when I see people criticize Trudeau. And it's like, I don't like Trudeau either. I have several grievances with him. I have my own personal things that I don't like about the guy. But don't be fooled for 1 second that the moment he's replaced with a conservative, or even someone from the People's Party of Canada, which is just a far-right party, nothing is going to change. The economy isn't going to come back. We're not going to rebuild industry all of a sudden. We're not going to regain our spot as the imperial lapdog of the industrial powerhouse of the world, the United States, because the United States isn't that anymore. Like, our position in Canada is what it is because of all of the decisions of all the conservative and all the liberal governments that came before this specific point. Like, yes, Trudeau has made some pretty stupid frickin' decisions, but the overall economic situation that's happening in Canada is also happening in the United States and Germany and the UK and every other Western country. And guess what? Trudeau is only in charge of one of them. Joe Biden is only in charge of one of them. They are not responsible for everything.
Right. Yeah. Right. They're puppets, man. Yeah. I mean, and the only way we're gonna solve anything in the long run. That doesn't mean don't resist and fight every struggle and win every battle you can. That's part of building to the bigger thing. I was just talking about this in the episode I'm editing before we got on here. But until you smash the capitalist state and take it and seize the means of production and reform the society. And look, even when we reform the society and have like a perfect socialist revolution, kumbaya, yay, we're going to have a whole lot of fucking problems too. But until we do that, we can't even begin to address the problems.
Well, you look at the period after the Russian Revolution, it was just a pure civil war. Like, that stuff is going to be resolved over the course of a decade.
It's ugly.
One thing I wanted to say to kind of bring this all together is the inevitable results of this war in Ukraine. Whether or not we end up with U.S. boots on the ground, or we end up with a U.S. retreat and reverse of policy, which I think is very unlikely at this point, but still possible, there is the undeniable fact that the United States on the world stage, their image is now tarnished. They are no longer the great military power. They haven't been since the Second World War, but this is finally going to cement it for a lot of people, because a lot of the global south in this conflict have had to take a side because they do massive amounts of trade with Russia. So if they denounced Russia in the UN, or they went against Russia in specific decisions, well, Russia isn't manipulative and doesn't have the same policy of you need to be aligned with us for us to do anything with you. None of these nations want to be aggressive towards Russia, and they don't see the American side any more favorably than the Russian side. Most of these people look at it as most leftists do and most communists do. Like, no war but class war. It's just imperialists fighting each other. Well, my opinion varies a little from that. I think it is pretty close to what that is. But at the end of the day, we're looking at, people call it a multipolar world order, but I think more accurately, it's going to be a bipolar world order, where you're going to have the Western economies, the Western sphere of the world. Their economies are going to become isolated, and they're going to kind of tinker on for a couple decades maybe as the Russian, Chinese, Indian, the Eastern economy led by the BRICS alliance, which now Saudi Arabia is joining. That's going to be the new, maybe not global hegemon, but that's going to be the new global center, if that's a good way to put it. Mainly because you have Saudi Arabia moving away from the petrodollar, the entire thing that forces countries to hold on to US dollar.
Stone, brother. Yeah.
It exactly is. So once that transition happens, and once Saudis either drop the US currency or fully adopt renminbi and the ruble to trade in for oil, you have a massive shift in the global economy.
Yeah.
And with all that, whatever the US military is going to do, as you know, with the fall of empires, they start to get into every kind of military endeavor they possibly can to try to reassert its power and reassert themselves. And they're going to get to a point where they're going to crumble. And you might even have a US military collapse. And then we may be looking at a United States of America that is going to crumble into separate nation states. But I think that's a long way down the road.
Yeah, and history can change and different things can happen. There's lots of variables as to how it all plays out, but I think you're on the money. Multipolar world, but I like that concept, but what you say about it being more of a bipolar world where you have the remnants of the Western powerhouse muddling along, and you've got the rise in the center island of mankind in Asia and stuff. But I would add to that there's also going to be these, to go back to the multipolar concept, there will be poles of influence within those bipoles.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, we're seeing a lot of developments in Latin America where they're trying to develop a Latin American currency.
Yeah.
And there's so much economic potential there. If they can cement that despite US imperialism, that'll be one pole. But in reality, it'll be part of that larger bipolar.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
It'll be much different than we have in the monopolar, I guess you'd call it, liberal world order, where it's the US, the WEF, the IMF, all those organizations, the UN, NATO. It's what they say or nothing, or you're gone. You agree with us full lockstep or you're gone. where you have the Eastern Bloc, if I can say, the BRICS nations, they work off of strategic cooperation. So they don't need you to agree on every single foreign policy objective they have. There's nations that have denounced Russia that still have trade agreements with them. But at the end of the day, they're all working towards, Xi Jinping talks about this all the time, that they're working towards a common prosperity for mankind, that they're working together to propel the human race forward. And whether or not that happens to be countries coming together in Latin America and countries coming together in Africa and making their own currencies and industries and economies, at the end of the day, we're all focused on bringing the human race further along to the next step of evolution, more or less. But you're going to have the Western world that is still, at least I think for a couple decades, is going to fall to civil war and chaos and is going to be fighting within itself to the point that it's going to be separated from the civilized world at that point.
It's going to become, you could even say maybe become what the third world was, and I'll say I think it's a very real possibility. I hope that the worst excesses of that can be avoided somehow. Like, that's just me trying to be optimistic. I don't know. I don't suspect even really that's how it'll play out. But for the sake of everybody living here and the people, I hope it can play out in a way where it's not as bad as all that, But, last thing I'd really like to say is, at the end of the day, like you said, I think most of humanity and our structures around the world have evolved to a degree. The consciousness has evolved to a degree that we realize we're all on this one planet. Yeah, we still love our nations, our ethnic groups, our religions, but we're on this fucking little pale blue dot, Carl Sagan, together, and we got to work it out some fucking way. And I think the only real barrier to that anymore is the American empire and its client states. I think the rest of the world, from China to South Africa to Latin America, realizes that the world doesn't have to be the way it's been with war and imperialism and one country dominating another. And I think, dare I say, that mankind may have learned the double-edged nature of empire, and that maybe the path to empire is not worth going down. I don't know. I mean, a lot of history between now and the next eon or whatever. Couldn't be another empire, but I feel in my heart maybe that mankind's realized the folly of that path, and the only thing left is the American empire holding it up,
One of the things I always like to say is war is war and time will tell. And that's what a lot of things boil down to. It's like, we can make all these predictions, we can make all these stipulations, but only time will tell. It's a quote from Stalin, and I'm going to really butcher what the actual quote was. But he's like,
away, brother.
The sands of time will dust away the negativity from my grave. So basically, history will show in the long run that the people who try to make up all these false narratives and all this bullshit about me, they're going to be proven to be the villains from the start. Those were the guys that are in NATO that came from Nazi generals and Ukrainian Nazi, you know what I mean? But it's a similar kind of thing where it's like we have to just remember that it's the sands of time that will decide it all, and we have to do our best to alleviate as much as we can in the interim. That's our work as leftists, right? Is to do what we can and fight the good fight, but it's going to get a lot worse before it gets any better.
Yeah.
And I guess the last thing I kind of wanted to say, it's going to be very telling what happens throughout this year. This year is going to be the most decisive time, I think, in the Western world. And things can completely turn around for Ukraine. It is possible. There could be U.S. boots put on the ground. They could repel Russia back, and they could get the regime change in Russia, crumble Putin, and decolonize Russia like they've been trying to for 3 decades now. We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, definitely, man. Well, hey, man, this has been absolutely awesome. It's been beautiful. It's been really great, like, kind of getting to know you and talking about the issues, man. I'm really isolated here. I'm in a small town, 30,000 people in Mason City. So I don't get a lot of this, man. It's good for my spirit, and I hope, my subscribers and anybody that's in your community can get some enjoyment out of it. Even if everything we've said is something they already know, I hope that, it just felt good to have a conversation. And before we sign off here, man, is there anything you want to plug? Do you want some followers on social media? Do you want to direct people to certain resources or?
What I'll do is the whole doc for the video you can share with your viewers, and on the top of that is my general source doc. So I'm working on that. I worked on that at the beginning of the conflict up until about April, just compiling resources around Ukraine, and now I'm kind of back at that document updating it. But I'll give you a link to my YouTube channel. I don't really do too much politics on that particular channel, but I might start doing it, especially after this. And anything, if you want me to come on and talk or just give my opinion on anything, man, you just let me know. I'm only a phone call away.
Yeah, I really love it. I got to say, you're really well read on this from just doing it in your free time and having the focus, as you called it, obsession. You got a good voice. You look good on camera, brother.
Thank you.
You should consider doing it, man. Give it a try. If it don't stick, whatever, man.
Yeah, man. I'm here if you ever want just someone to bounce stuff off of, or you just want a second voice.
This went really well. I think I'd like to do it again. So on maybe more narrow of a subject.
Yeah, for sure.
Bite size it.
I was trying to go over a lot today, so I know I missed a lot that I wanted to mention, but I think I got a lot of the main points that I wanted to bring up, however jumbled they were. But I really appreciate you having me on, man. It's awesome.
Cool. Yeah. Other than that, so I'll get those links for you guys. Anybody watching, they should be in the comments box or the text box. If they're not, I know my memory's terrible, and I always say I'm going to do this, and I don't. Drop a comment. Let me know if they're not. I'll comment them down the road. Other than that, guys, don't forget to like. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to check out Colton's resources if you're wanting to fact check us a little bit so you don't think we're full of shit. And remember, you guys can join me on Patreon for $1 a month for independent media, support conversations like this. I'm really making a push to try to do this full time, and I can do that with your guys' support. So with that, guys, we'll sign off right here, and I'll catch you later. All right, Colton?
All right. Have a good night, guys.
Cool. Take it easy. Bye.
Don't feel anything.